Welcome back to The Great Game. This is, believe it or not, episode 30. We got to sit down with John Mizon from Southwest Megagames to talk about Den of Wolves. Den of Wolves is a game that we have made commentary on before in comparisons and all kinds of things on the podcast before. So it was good to finally get to chat to John and run through the legacy of this game that most people in the megagame space seem to have heard of by now, and really dig into what made it such a successful mega game around the world and how it all works. We've also been doing some admin tidy up on our end, recognizing that we're at 30 episodes, and so we've consolidated all of our links and socials and ways to reach out to us and all of that into a link tree, because that is what the kids do these days. You'll be able to find a link to that in the show notes. Also, we finally bit the bullet after presumably about 4 years, and we have a dedicated email address, greatgamepod@gmail. So by all means, if you jump through the link tree linked below, you can find a form to fill out if you'd like to contact us, if you'd like to talk to us, if you'd like to query something we said or dispute it. Or you can just send us an email if that's easier. But by all means, we would really love to hear from you, particularly around what you would like to hear in the next 30 episodes that we do. People that you would like to hear from, games that you would like covered, ideas, design things, any debates that you would like to see fleshed out and resolved once and for all. Get in touch. We're here to serve. Hopefully you enjoy this conversation with John, and if you find yourself listening along and decide Den of Wolves is for you, there is also a link in the notes below directly to John's website, Southwest Megagames, where you can buy Den of Wolves Radio right now. Enjoy the episode. So, John, thanks so much for coming and having a chat to us today. Why don't you just, for those who haven't heard your name before, why don't you just give us a bit of an introduction to yourself and who you are in the mega game world and how you came into mega gaming?
So I've been mega gaming for almost 9 years now. I came into it in 2015. Like other people, I was introduced to mega games via the Shut 'Em Sit Down video, as I was a board gamer at the time.
Yep.
And I was sort of thinking, oh, that sounds like a really interesting thing. Thought about putting something together myself where I lived. Um, and I've eventually just got around to sort of buying the Watch the Skies pack from Jim Wallman, and just ran that game myself. After I'd run it a few times, I decided to sort of do it more often and get it set up as sort of a hobby business. So since then, I've been running mega games, Southwest Mega Games, in the UK, especially in the Southwest, as you might have been able to tell. And yeah, I've just been sort of doing that since then. And I think most people who know me either know me from Southwest Mega Games directly or as the designer of Den of Wolves, which has been run across the world now in a lot of different places.
Many times. Yeah.
Mm.
And so when you set up Southwest, you hadn't created Den of Wolves just yet. Was Den
No.
of Wolves the first game that you formally put pen to paper on?
So no. So there's a couple of things. So the first games I did were Watch the Skies and Crisis in Britannia. Crisis in Britannia being a mega game about the second Roman invasion of Britain.
Right.
And both of those games, whilst they were games I bought from John Wallman, I also sort of modified them and reformatted them somewhat heavily. So they're sort of, they're still Jim's games, but I'd say they're like sort of 20% my game as well. And I put a lot of work into sort of changing some things. A lot of them based on Jim's suggestions from feedback he'd got from running the games himself, but also some, some ideas and some concepts that I wanted to throw in there. And So on top of that, I also did have one original game before Den of Wolves called A World Divided, which I ran several times, which is sort of a sci-fi game, but based on the American Revolutionary War. So you have some factions representing different, colony cities and the areas around those cities on a planet, and you have sort of a force that lives elsewhere, sort of this interstellar superpower, and they're interested in keeping the colonies loyal, whereas the colonies are quite interested in potentially switching to being independent, and how much they make the choice of going towards independence versus staying loyal as a key part of the game. So that's been around longer than Den of Wolves has, but after that, Den of Wolves was the next game I came up with.
Right. And do you remember when that was, Den of Wolves, the first time you ran it?
Um, I think it was somewhere in 2018.
Right.
I could look it up, but it was sort of around that time, um, maybe late 2017, early 2018.
Mm. Yeah, that sounds
Nice.
about right to my memory. I think so. I went and played Den of Wolves in Wellington, in New Zealand, and I think it was 2018. So it must have been shortly after, as soon as you
Yeah.
got it out on the market. And then I suppose, I mean, we can probably dig into this a little bit after we talk about Den of Wolves, but just briefly, since Den of Wolves, what have you been working on since then?
So, I mean, there's been a number of things. So, there's Watch the Sky's Second Sight, which is my sort of Watch the Sky's spiritual sequel game, which is uh, quite different to the original Watch the Skies. It's definitely kept a lot of stuff, but it's also added up a whole bunch of things and reformatted a bunch of things. Um, I did another sort of reformatting of a game called Urban Nightmare Wisconsin, which is, um, for those who haven't played it, Urban Nightmare is another mega game that's been around a little bit about a zombie outbreak in a US city and state, and it's all about how the different authorities at the state, federal, and city level sort of interact with each other. So that was another sort of big reformatting that I did. I've also done Sugar and Sedition, which is my game about the Cuban Revolutionary conflict.
Hmm.
Really fascinating conflict. I thought it was very suitable for a game because there's a lot of different moving parts and a lot of different actors with very variable abilities to sort of trust each other. Um, I also made Planetfall, which was an online game back during, I don't know if you remember, but there was a couple of years or so when we were doing a lot of stuff online.
Yes, yeah,
Um,
I do just
Yes.
vaguely remember.
yeah, so I designed an online mecha game for that. I also have Heist, which is I mean, some people call them mini mega games.
Hmm.
So it's for 10 players, so not large enough to actually be a mega game, but it has a lot of the same stuff with the mega games about sort of communication and separated information levels and stuff. And that's my game where sort of one team is a bunch of people in a bank, and the bank's been locked down, and then the other team is the authorities outside the bank. So you have sort of the political mayor, and you have police element, and you have the technical specialists, and they all have sort of slightly different angles to approach the situation from.
Yeah, right.
Um, yeah, and other than that, I've also just been sort of communicating with other game designers, and I've run a few sort of guest games as part of Southwest Mega Games as well.
So very,
Awesome.
very busy in the last few years, design-wise and mega game-wise.
Yeah. I've also got another game in the pipeline, which is a fantasy game, but it's one of those things which is infinitely on the back burner. Um,
Okay.
I've gotten sort of
Yes.
busy over the last
Very
couple of
familiar
years.
with those. Awesome. So super prolific. But yeah, let's dive into Den of Wolves. It is a very successful game, but for those who haven't heard of it, what's the pitch? What's the game about?
So Den of Wolves is a sci-fi game where the players are playing as a fleet of spaceships who are fleeing from an unconquerable enemy that is trying to destroy them. So it is a crisis survival situation. I describe it as a semi-cooperative game in that, broadly speaking, all the teams are on the same side, but there are internal frictions, and it's a game that's sort of about the how everyone within the game balances sort of central power, keeping everyone safe, and decentralized power, giving everyone the freedom to do what they want, and sort of the delicate balance between civilian government and military power in such a sort of crisis survival scenario.
It's I think so for a lot of people who've heard about the game, it conjures certain images for them, and then others who have never heard of the game might have similar images. Obviously, the game Den of Wolves, I think, obviously, has a pretty clear inspiration. But what other what were your inspirations when you first sat down to design this?
Yeah. So I mean, to be clear, obviously, we're talking about the fact that it is inspired loosely by Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah, of course.
It does not have any of the characters' scripts or other identifiable intellectual properties of Battlestar Galactica, which I hasten to add. But it's the premise. So like if you're familiar with Battlestar Galactica, big enemy, and then these ships, they're desperately trying to keep transparent, honest politics alive, but they are in a desperate situation, so they're not sure if they should be instituting martial law and doing all these other various things, whilst also just desperately trying to survive. But in terms of other inspirations, I think Den of Wolves is a very interesting game because I started off with that kind of premise in my mind, and after that point, alongside some really basic mechanics that I've taken inspiration from various mega games. There's no one specific one, but just some basic mechanics and resources and stuff from other mega games. Most of the inspiration I would describe as sort of mechanically generated. So a lot of the stuff, it was like, well, we should have this and this and this because that would make sense. They need to survive. They need food and water. So here's a ship that makes food. Here's a ship that makes water. And everything just kind of naturally evolved from these sort of mechanical drives, which I think is, I mean, I could be wrong. I don't know what everyone else's designs are coming from, but I feel like that's relatively unique in terms of inspiration for a mega game.
Yeah, well, it does. I mean, it's quite a politically rich plot, I suppose, or setup. And then,
Yeah.
as you say, lots of mechanical requirements just come out of that, including the paranoia and like you said, the balance of politics and power. So, it's fascinating that that's the way it evolved.
I wouldn't have expected that, to be honest. I think that it would be, mechanics driven rather than the top down trying to simulate Battlestar Galactica in a mega game kind of thing. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that was obviously the loose kind of concept at the top of it, but a lot of it was starting with sort of the resources and the mechanics. And I think also another thing is, because obviously, like I said, it's a game about survival. So anything which doesn't help you survive is going to get kicked out the window immediately. So I did think about there being sort of a money system in the game, and one of the ships is really keen on keeping economy and money existing. But I also thought 9 times out of 10, I'm pretty sure players are just going to start ignoring money on turn 1 or 2 because you can't eat it. So it sort of becomes worthless in a mechanical sense. And so I think it sort of forced me to just stick to only the resources that made sense and developing things sort of from there. Yeah.
So take us through those resources. How does that element of the game work in terms of the mechanics?
So obviously there's food and water, which are 2 interconnected resources. Every ship needs a certain amount of food or water. Some need more than others, because some of the ships are quite big and they have a lot of crew and a lot of people, and some of them are quite small and quite specialized and they have far fewer people. But they all need a certain amount of food and water, and you also need to use water to generate food. So it's an interlinked system. You also have fuel, which is mined as ore, and then one of the ships is a refinery that turns the ore into usable fuel, and then that fuel is required to make the faster than light jumps, which is basically how you keep the fleet moving so that they're not immediately threatened by giant enemy navies all the time. And you also have materials, which is sort of the resource for everything else. So if you want to build something or fix something, materials is what you do for that. You also have other resources. So obviously, security teams, marines, fighter ships. These are all also resources. You can definitely think of them that way. And so all of the ships tend to, produce one of these things in one way or another. And of course, crew themselves are another resource. And then you have some sort of special, unique ones that occur in small numbers that spice up some of the ships a little bit. So that's sort of the basics of how the game works in terms of resources.
And what kind of decision points do you find this resource system kind of pushes players into? Like, what did you want them to be considering in terms of managing these resources or spreading them out across the fleet or dealing with that element?
So, I mean, there's a few things. So, in terms of how you use the resources that you have, for food and water especially, there is a choice in how much you give people. So, if you give people less food or water, there's different levels, and if you give them sort of less rations, then the morale gets worse. And obviously, you can also give them more rations than they need to improve morale. So there is sort of always this decision of, do we meter things out to help things last longer or to help out others versus do we just try and keep it steady versus do we overuse some resources to keep our ship happy, either, stopping them from getting worse or genuinely just trying to keep it so happy because that's a success metric. And then similar things with like the fuel and the materials, you probably won't have enough for absolutely everything. So you have to prioritize, okay, do we make a shorter jump to save fuel? Do we repair the guns or do we repair the food generator? There's a lot of sort of different choices to be made with limited resources, which I think is true for a lot of mega games, but with Den of Wolves, it's very core to the every minute to minute decisions. And sort of how that goes. And then you have the other thing, which is if you have resources, if you're a resource generator, which a lot of the ships are, as I said, there's the decision of what to do. Obviously, there's a lot of power to be had in, well, I make all the food. So if you don't do what I want you to, maybe you won't get any food this turn. But you have to balance that out with, if you say that, it's very easy for people to turn on you. So there's this sort of very careful, very soft power you have to do when it comes to generating resources and how they get given out and who they get given to, which I think is important, especially when resources get thin because the food generator is damaged or you've got a whole bunch of extra people to feed. So that's another sort of decision that comes in with regard to sources.
Awesome. That makes total sense. That's really nice. And I understand. So communication is obviously key, and kind of how that works between ships and the movement between ships. How does that element of the game work in practice?
So yeah, obviously, like in any game, communication is key. And I think so in Den of Wolves, it's pretty simple. There's a couple of little tweaks to it. So there's nothing stopping players from just walking around and talking to whoever they want. But it is made very explicit in the rules that if you walk over to another table, another ship, then you are physically, you're taking a little shuttle and you're flying over to that ship. So if that ship gets attacked or, if someone wants to attack you, then obviously you put yourself at risk by visiting someone else's ship. Also, because of the nature of, a spaceship, each spaceship has its own sort of authority. They're almost like their own miniature countries, right? So if that person was looking to detain you, they'd have a much easier time on their own ship than if they were on your ship or a neutral third party. Because, the security teams on that ship answer to that ship's first officer. So that's sort of an element there. And as an extension of that, when the fleet is attacked, in what we call wolf attacks, when the wolf forces actually attempt to attack the fleet directly, everyone is forced to stay on whatever ship they were on when the attack started. So attacks, interestingly, they don't just damage the ships from all the ships attacking them, but they also hurt communications because everyone's suddenly trapped in these bubbles for several minutes. And absolutely, you can talk to people there, or you can write down messages and send them to other ships. And that can create some really interesting information dynamics. If it's like, well, okay, I can only talk to you for 5 minutes, so what can we talk about? And I think that's really interesting in how it affects things there.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I really love.
I was just going to say, there's also a potential third option where obviously the ships make these jumps and they're jumping to specific locations, and either through mechanical fault or player choice slash player uh, inaccuracy, you can occasionally have situations where the fleet is separated from each other. So one or more ships flies to a different location to everywhere else, and then obviously those people get separated from communicating with each other as well, which can add another element to the communication challenges in the game.
Nice, love it. Yeah, I feel like that's so classic mega game, having those communication challenges there, and I love that mechanic of locking down communications when an attack is in progress, to simulate how no one's exactly sure what's happening. That's great. And how does that combat side of things work when attacks are happening and enemy ships are coming in?
So I mean, like with most mega games, the combat has to be really, really simple. So it's normally just sort of a dice roll per unit, sees how well it does, and which ships it attacks and how much damage it does. I'd say the important thing about the combat is oftentimes the outcome is related to two things. One is where the fleet has decided to position itself in advance. So some of the ships have guns, and some of the ships have fighter units. And so where those ships are positioned, obviously, affects how well defended different parts of the fleet are, because there's 4 different areas that the ships are in. So if you're in a quadrant which has a lot more fighters, you're probably safer when an attack happens. So there's a lot of decisions before the fight about sort of positioning and things like that. There's also, as I mentioned, the fleet is constantly trying to jump further and further away, but the enemies are also steadily getting closer all the time. So that's where sort of the pressure is on to keep those jumps happening, because if you don't jump, then every turn the pursuit track, we call it, goes up by 1. And the higher the pursuit track is, the more damaging, or the bigger the enemy fleet is when it arrives for a wolf attack. So it's the combat, once it's started, isn't nearly as important as where you were before the combat started in terms of the pursuit track and where you position your units.
That makes total sense.
Which, yeah, I think is another interesting sort of decision for players to do with their resources and their alliances and whatnot. Whereas the combat itself is designed to be pretty simple, and there's not a huge number of. There's a few decisions to be made with the combat, but they're pretty small and quick, so that the combat can be done as quickly as possible.
Awesome. And then I think a pretty huge element of the game is the traitor element, which, at least when I've heard people discuss the game or talk about the game, I think that's very often kind of emphasized as a key element. But I think it's interesting that you describe it more of a semi-co-op style of game rather than a traitor game. So tell us about the traitor stuff and how that kind of evolved and how you see that articulating in the game.
Yeah, so I think the thing about the traitor thing is it's much more interesting to talk about than the rest of the game, right? It's the thing that generates the exciting stories and those crazy betrayal moments. Like if you think about a classic game like Diplomacy, right? How many people are talking about the strategic moves they made versus how many people are talking about that time someone stabbed them in the back? So I think the interesting thing about the game, and the way I've described it so far, is that in terms of what the players spend their time doing and dealing with, even the players that interact with the traders the most are probably going to spend 80 to 90% of their game interacting with things that have nothing to do with traders. Like there's so much just sort of communicating about where we're going to jump next, who's giving me these resources, if you need extra security, what laws are coming out from the council and that kind of stuff. So the game itself, in terms of actual time taken, it isn't super traitor focused. So that's sort of the interesting thing, is that there's all these elements to it, and you could run it without traitors, and it would still be a viable game. And when I say it's a semi-cooperative game, that's because 97% of the players, or 95% of the players, are playing that semi-cooperative game, and it's only a really small fraction that are playing the other version. So the traitors, as I'm sure many people know, but if you don't, there are a small number of players in the game, just 1, 2, 3 players, depending on sort of how big the game is, who are secretly briefed that they are working for the enemy forces, the wolf forces, and their sole objective is to cause as much disruption and destruction as possible. And they're advised that they may want to, play it quietly and sneakily for as long as possible so they can do as much damage without being found out. So that sort of inherently adds another element to the game. And as you say, there's sort of a paranoia element. A lot of people will get accused incorrectly. And it's really kind of up to the players as to how they do this. Some people will go more political with it and try and just sort of foment dissent within the player base. Some people will just actively sabotage systems or poison things or try and reveal the fleet's current location into deep space so that the wolf fleet can pick it up and get closer. So it's really interesting seeing how different players deal with that and how other players sort of react to the idea that there might be a secret infiltrator within the team. So it's definitely an interesting thing. I think another really important thing about the infiltrators that isn't immediately obvious is that it's a really critical instigator for the relevance of the council and the idea of centralization of power. So, it's very easy. Megagames quite big, right? But they can also, relative to running a real country or a real spaceship, they're quite small. You're talking 20 to 60 people, 80 people, certain games. And I think there's a big tendency in Megagames to be just like, well, I'm trying to solve my own problem here. Just leave me alone and let me do it. Which certainly makes sense, right? A lot of the times, other people don't have the information you have to know what's going on, and you can solve your own problems most efficiently. This is, especially true in making games where communication is often so rushed and everything. But obviously, in Den of Wolves, you have that risk of don't look at anything I'm doing. Let me solve my own problems. Opens you up to a massive point of failure risk, right? Because if the person you're leaving alone and letting solve all the problems is actively working against you without your knowledge, they can do a lot of damage compared to if there's oversight set up or if there's the ability to police or investigate or intervene, which is powers you can grant to a central authority. So I feel like it's sort of an important, like I said, an important instigator for giving central authority to a third party who can help stop, rogue or dangerous elements.
That makes sense. So that's like a key instigator for the kind of secret police or central authority themes of the game. It's really interesting that you say that the semi-co-op nature is, kind of much more prevalent. It makes sense because I guess that is also how the board games articulate. Like in the Battlestar Galactica board game, like you can play half the game without a trader, or in a lot of games have a similar mechanic where there may not be traders or the traders don't show up until a decent way into the game. So the game that you're just playing in terms of co-op and just making decisions has to be pretty good and pretty interesting without traders. Otherwise, it's probably going to suck. But tell us how the council stuff works then, and how that mechanic works out.
So it's pretty simple. So there's 11 ships in the game, but there's only 6 nations. So each ship will be from one of those nations, and then each of those nations has a representative on the quote-unquote Interstellar Council. And essentially, the Interstellar Council is a simple body where they say, should we create new laws or edicts or orders that will then be legally binding for the rest of the fleet? And there's a number of suggested ones that the game comes with, but because it's a mega game, you come up with whatever ones you want. You can be as specific or as non-specific as you like to suit what you think works best. And these things will go out. So some obvious ones being like, can the government determine how much water and food everyone gets, or and it doesn't even have to be they mandate numbers. It could just be a case of we're allowed to look at how much water and food you have, and if you've got too much, we can take some off you. and other ones like, is the military allowed to intervene on individual ships without certain levels of reasoning behind it? How far do we need to go before we're allowed to send Marines on legally? And there's all kinds of things along those lines. I think there's like 8 or 9 different suggested things that the council might want to do. So, like I say, it's this whole thing of like, well, how much do we want a third party to be able to say, legally you have to stop this. Legally, we're allowed to send in Marines to stop you, and we're going to do it because we think it's a risk. Versus how much, do you not want those kind of discussions happening elsewhere and coming to where you are and where you have more information about local issues?
I love how it seems like every element. So I haven't personally played Den of Wolves, Pat has, but I love how it seems like every element really ties so strongly into that theme of how much power should we hand over to a central authority. That's really awesome. Yeah, and with the trader elements and that side of the game, how I guess one of my concerns, I guess, has been when I'm looking at trader mechanics in mega games, just in my own designs, has been making sure that the trader players have a good time. I think that seems like a really key part of it, and it seems like a really like could be a point of failure where traders are either found out easily and end up getting immediately exposed or messed up, or where perhaps the wrong person is chosen as a trader. I'm sure you do kind of an intense casting process for Den of Wolves, but how do you handle that side of things and make sure that, I guess, the right person is the trader, or that the traders have a good time in the game, or do well, or do okay?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, and I think I'm surprised by how well trades have gone. But I think there's some really important sort of safety checks that I do for that. So obviously, like you said, there's some casting. People do sometimes just when they sign up, they say, "I'd be happy to be a wolf," or "I'd love to be a wolf." Um, wolf being sort of a synonym for traitor because the wolves are the enemies.
Right, right.
And they so sometimes it's that easy, but also an important thing is I don't make people into traitors before the game starts. It's not a pre-game briefing. Um, Once the game has started, or maybe a few minutes before the first turn has started, whilst people are setting up, I will take the player subtly to a second room or something, and just say, I'm going to make you an offer to make your game more difficult, but also potentially much more interesting. Do you want that sort of additional challenge? Are you happy with that? And they make it very clear that they are allowed to say no if they're unsure or if they don't want it. And that does happen. I'd say 1 out of every 5 players I ask says no, and I'll find someone else. And eventually you'll always find someone who says yes. Um, so the player themselves does get to confirm whether or not they actually want it, and that's, I think, a really key element of it. But also, I think that a big problem with sort of traitors, especially in like board games, is that you know suspicion will be drawn to you, and the way that the players deal with that, because of how the game works, is, oh, we're just not going to let you do anything. We're going to lock you out of all the game's mechanics. And that doesn't really happen in Den of Wolves because, I mean, typically the way it tends to go is that if suspicion is being drawn to someone, one of two things will happen. They'll immediately get sort of arrested or otherwise sort of, persecuted in a very direct way, which leads to more things happening. Or, they'll flee. They'll do one last dramatic action. They'll just charge towards the engines and try and blow them up, or they'll charge to the bridge and try and shoot everyone, or they'll flee to a different ship where they have more sympathy and become sort of this, outspoken political critic. So there's no sort of mechanical benefit to just saying, well, I'm going to let you keep playing, but I'm also going to not let you do anything fun. Which I think happens in certain board games just because of how they're designed. So it's typically either a binary, either no one knows you're the traitor and you're playing the game like a normal person, except with this additional challenge and these additional goals, or everyone knows or kind of assumes you're a traitor, and it's this other game about doing a crazy thing or trying to escape or doing 4-dimensional chess moves to try play other players against them and act as if they're the bad guy.
That makes total sense, and that's definitely a situation I've seen in other, trader board games where, you've basically figured out someone's a traitor, not explicitly maybe, but you pretty much know for sure, so you're just not going to let them talk or do anything or go on any missions, and it can be a bit of a miserable experience. And then I'm curious, are there any mechanics that explicitly expose the traitors in terms of, I think the board game has a Cylon detector or something like that. Are there anything like that, or is it purely based on the decisions and the role playing and things like that?
It's purely based on sort of decision. It's very free form, the whole traitor element of the game.
Mm-mm.
I don't think there's a single mechanic in the game that is traitor based. So it's literally just a case of the traitor wants to do X, and the control says, okay, you did it, and then depending on the dice roll, maybe you left some evidence behind, or maybe not. Or there have been times when teams have tried to like build a lie detector or a wolf detector, and that is also a free-form action. There's no sort of existing thing in the game, so it always sort of comes up one way or another. But there's no sort of mechanical hit or miss or resource you can just spend to do a thing.
Yeah, nice.
I was really interested, just before we move on from the whole trader mechanics. Well, as we've just said, not so much mechanics, but part of the game. Dead of Wolves is quite prolific. It's been, I mean, especially recently in the last couple of years, it's been in the community zeitgeist heavily and run a lot of times. Have you encountered since you first made the game? Have you encountered a sort of meta that has started to form where people have strategies around how to deal with the mechanics in the game? Like, I mean, so the game's a big cooperative puzzle to crack, really, and like you've talked about, trying to figure out how much is too much power to take or to give. And then there's obviously trader mechanics attached to it as well, where people are immediately on edge and expecting, based on the name of the game, that there's someone sort of not on the level. Have you encountered the need to change the way the game is presented because people have sort of cottoned on and have strategies to approach these things?
I mean, I'm glad to say I haven't had to do that. I think there's been a lot of really interesting sort of micro strategies which come up, but no one's ever sort of come up with a holistic approach. And I think that's a really good sign, because I think one of the key things about it is that you can't really tell where the problems are going to be, because a lot of the problems are randomly generated by the wolf attacks. Like, when the ships come in, it's completely random which ships they target and which parts of the ships get damaged. So, whether the food generators get taken out or whether the weapons get taken out is, something that's going to be completely different every game, and which ships take the most damage and stuff. And then also, which ship the wolf is on is completely different each game. So, like, I think as a broad strokes puzzle, there is no sort of single solution. There's some things people have done, like, trying to make sure that the council as productive as possible, which is, trying to make any meeting productive is an inherent human challenge, I think.
Yeah.
And people being like, okay, well, if you're going to use your ships, always attack these kinds of ships first, which I can understand the logic behind, but there is always a plus and a minus depending on for which ones you hit. And other people will come in with strategies. Some people have said, well, this person is my friend is too good at lying, so I'm just going to kill him on turn one, and just in case. It's not a strategy I think anyone's really used, but it's ones they quite love threatening to use.
Right. Yeah.
So it's these sort of micro suggestions, but I don't think I've ever seen anything that's like broken the game or has had anything other than like a minor effect on one specific mechanic. And if they do figure those things out, then that's fine. That's sort of a strategic challenge that they've overcome.
Yeah. No, fair enough.
Nice. And just before we move off traders, I'm curious if you warn people up front that traders are going to be a part of the game. I know I've seen some different groups handle this differently, and I guess now it is probably well known that it's a part of the game. But I guess at least in the first few runs, how did you handle that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is interesting, but I also think it's not super important. So obviously, in the first few runs of the game, it was less obvious this was going to happen. Even today, when I'm running the game, I never explicitly say there's going to be traitors. And I know some people do that primarily so that they can cast it more easily. So they can say there is going to be traitors. How do you feel about being a traitor or being on a team with a traitor? So that they
Mm.
can make sure that that dynamic always works out. I think I have the benefit that a lot of the people who play my games, I've met them before, so I can get that vibe. And as you say, with the game having run so many times now, most people who play it will know that traders is going to be a thing, or they know that Battlestar Galactica has traders, so they're going to sort of assume that that's baked into this game as well, even if they've not heard of Den of Wolves. So it's not like a huge thing either way. I think whether or not you sort of admit that traders exist, because
Right,
players will
right.
probably figure it out pretty quick.
Yeah, of course, of course. And then finally, on the on the mechanical side of things, I believe the Wolf fleet is fully just controlled by the control team, rather than being a player team, like for example, Aliens and Watch the Skies or other things like that. What motivated that decision, and how have you seen that play out?
So I think in the very, very early stages of design, I was picturing the Wolves as being a play team. Um, Partially because it's a very Watch the Skies esque thing to have this sort of separate team whose goals may be quite different to the rest of the game. Um, in the Battlestar Galactica show, the Cylons have essentially their own alien team, right? There's just a bunch of Cylons talking to each other about what
Mm.
they're going to do next, who aren't a part of the main fleet. Um, so it's an interesting idea, but sort of the more I thought about it, the more I thought it was just functionally not a workable part of the game. Yeah, if anyone ever does come up with a really great idea for how to make a played wolf team, I'd love to hear it. But my thinking was always they've got like one decision to make, right? Which is either continue the status quo, in which case they've done nothing and the game continues as usual and they're trying to destroy everyone, or let's stop trying to kill everyone and engage them diplomatically. At which point the game is over, because what is there to do at that point? You can talk to the wolves, and I don't know how many players are going to be able to talk to the wolves at once. Maybe we just have a big group discussion, but like fundamentally, none of the ships are getting damaged. You don't need to jump. The game just kind of falls apart mechanically, and if you negotiate a peace with wolves, the game is over. So, like, I don't see what the wolves are going to do. Like, they have no decision to make. Maybe
Mm.
there's like a tactical game in how they play it, but once again, if they succeed in that tactical game, they've obliterated the fleet and the game is over. And even then, even ignoring that, I think just the tactical game on its own isn't enough to be a game for someone in the middle of a mega game. There's not enough to do there. There's no negotiation with other players. It's just a case of, do I send these ships here or here for 6 hours?
Mm.
Which is fine if your game is entirely based around that. But this is a mega game where people are socializing, and there's not much else to do if you're not doing that. So
Yeah, it would be hard to get to sell, I suppose, if that was
yeah,
the game. Yeah, so we've got a game designed here in Australia it has very similar inspirations, I should say, and aspirations, but it's quite a very different game. And I actually haven't played it yet, but I know that in the first run, at least the first run of that game, so say they did have a team that ran the aggressor side, and it leaned heavily. I mean, from my understanding, it leaned heavily on the Watch the Skies model, where there was sort of politics within the alien team, and they had decisions to make about resources and that kind of thing. But even then, I think I don't think Justin would mind me saying that it was lacking, and it was. I think it's something they're interested in changing in future, just based on the player experience. So it makes sense given this setting, because when you get down to it, the concept of this game, it really is about that semi-cooperative, everyone in a big sort of town hall trying to get along and balance, needs versus survival.
Yeah.
It's the wolves are just another factor, that they have to worry about, but they're not the protagonist of the story.
Yeah, and right. Like, I think if you wanted to create a wolf game, you'd almost have to make a second game of Den of Wolves running simultaneously, right? Which was the wolves game, and they had resources to worry about, and they had to negotiate with themselves and come up with all these political strategies. At which point, just run another game of Den of Wolves.
Right? Yeah, yeah. Den of humans or something.
Yeah.
So I mean that's quite a comprehensive overview of the game. From at least from here in Australia and sort of engaging with the active sort of online community that's been flourishing in the last couple of years, Den of Wolves seems really quite common. I feel like I see the name more often than I do watch the skies these days, which is not sort of to take a shot at any game, but it's in the 2014 to 16 or so, everyone was playing Watch the Skies, and it was that gateway game really for obvious reasons. Um, but now a lot of people are running Den of Wolves. Did you expect it to be as popular as it seems to have been? And
No,
sort of when you were designing it, were you planning to publish it and put it out into the world the way that you did?
no, not at all. It was just sort of the next game I made, just like the rest of them.
Yeah.
And uh, I think it was so just no idea that anyone didn't have any intentions of selling it or anything. I think what happened was, Johan over at Gothenburg Megagames, he said he wanted to run it for Gothenburg Megagames. So I made a version that was all PDFs and ready to go and sold it to him. And once you've done that for one person, you've done all the work you need to do to sell it to anyone else. So then it was just sort of available, and it just kind of took off from there. Yeah, no intention of selling it when I was designing it. No idea that this would happen when I was designing it. It just sort of happened.
Do you have any inkling about what makes it so popular, or what the secret to the design is that has made so many people interested in it?
Um, I'm not sure because, like I said, I didn't design it with that intention. So
Mm,
there's no sort of clear thing where I'm like, well, yeah, because of this. People have told me various, reasons over the years that they thought it was, and I think to a certain extent they're all true. And maybe some of these things are more true for some people, and some of these things are more true for other people.
mm,
But I think if I sort of narrowed it down, I think for one thing, sci-fi is a surprisingly accessible theme that draws in a lot of people. A lot of people find it interesting. Obviously, it being sort of loosely inspired by Battlestar Galactica brings in people who are fans of that show. But even if you're not a fan of Battlestar Galactica, like I say, just it being a cool sci-fi game with spaceships tends to in people. The people have pointed out that the balance between sort of standard mechanics and interesting freeform options is good. That sort of there's a good sort of there's enough standard stuff that people don't feel lost if they're not doing random freeform stuff, but there's still space to do that kind of freeform stuff to create those sort of really curated narratives that are sort of very individualistic and very exciting. Um, it's a very control light game. I've run it with 2 control, including myself, in the
mm.
past multiple times, and even with max control, it's still 4 people, including game control, which is quite low for a lot of games. You can also run it with only 20 people ish as minimum, so it's a game you can run with. So if it's your first mega game, you don't need a lot of control, you don't need a lot of players. And I think that's something that's obviously just really appealing for logistical reasons. Um, and I think as mega games go, um, the mechanical stuff is really baked into the talking stuff. So, like I said, you've got all these resources like food, water, security units, crew, fuel. But fundamentally, in order for those resources to get distributed, you have to talk to other players. You have to communicate, oh, what do you need? What do I have? And negotiate, what am I willing to give you? What are you willing to give me in return? Are sort of baked into the pure mechanical systems. Um, so I think people really appreciate that because, a lot of people out there will say that the heart of any mega game is communicating. And I think to a large degree that's true. So the fact that this is a game which sort of requires you to communicate even over the most basic mechanics is just another thing that people find sort of appealing and why they recommend it.
Yeah, no, I mean, that all makes sense. It sounds like the perfect sort of alignment of all these components. I think the logistical ones in particular make it very approachable. I was really surprised when I was talking to someone recently in the UK about Dead of Wolves, and I was surprised at how few people you need to run it. I didn't believe that at first, but that definitely makes it appealing. And I suppose I would go as far to say I might add to your list that when you did put this together, it didn't feel, at least from our perspective as people coming in, having just seen the shut up and sit down video, that there were a lot of mega games out there to get your hands on. I feel like Den of Wolves became mainstream around that time, where people were keen to run games but didn't really know where to start, and there weren't a huge number of big names available.
It being around since 2018 sort of definitely helped. I think, I mean, even now, there's a lot of games that have been put online, but the number of them that are just 100% ready to go are still pretty small.
Yep.
Because a lot of people are, they're doing this in their free time. They don't have a lot of time to sort of tidy everything up. They don't have a lot of time to run a game multiple times to make sure that it's been tweaked and iterated on. Some people do, but just the number of people who have that is much smaller than the number of people uploading games in general. So yeah, I think it has that advantage of also being sort of, it's a game that's been run many, many times. It's a game where everything is ready to go. It's all it's all ready to go in PDFs and good formatting and stuff, so that you can just run it pretty much as is.
Yep. And so I think we talked briefly about this when we were emailing before we sat down to record. But have you talked to many people who have bought the game and heard about their experiences, or heard about things that they tried different, that kind of thing, or are you kind of insulated from all the iterations that have happened?
I hear a bit. I think there's not that many people who have actually made that much in the way of changes.
Hmm.
I think a lot of people who have changed the game have mainly just changed it even aesthetically.
Right.
So I know East of Midlands Megagames in particular, they made loads of beautiful 3D models for all the ships. And I've seen the Gothenburg Megagames one where they had these really lovely visual designs for each of the big ships, and you have all these different rooms, and it's very visually lovely. And so, but in terms of, I don't think there's been that much in the way of changing the game as a game. And I've definitely heard back from people who have run the game. I get emails, I see the occasional after action report. But yeah, for the most part, there's not a huge need to communicate back to me how everything went and all details of what happened
Mm.
and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I would say mostly I'm insulated from it, but I do hear stuff from time to time.
Yep. And do you I suppose, like, since it was first created and you were sort of confident enough to put it out there in the world, have you yourself made changes to it, or have you wanted to ever go back and sort of tinker with things, or are you quite happy with where it's at?
I still tinker a bit. So I mean, interestingly, the game changed a lot between the first time I ran it and the second time I ran it.
Mm.
In particular, I think there were no shuttles in the first version of the game. So if you have played the game, you'll know that if you want to move food and water around, it can only be done in a shuttle. You need this big transport shuttle to move these resources around. And that wasn't there. Also, the second version of the game, I made the briefs much more aggressive towards each other compared to the first version of the game, because people felt it was too cooperative. There wasn't enough reason to disagree with people or try to play things off against each other. So the briefs became a bit more competitive after that. Like I say, they're still mostly cooperative. Everyone's goal is to not have the fleet collapse in on itself. But broadly speaking, there's a little bit more of sort of, you should come out slightly better than everyone else. But yeah, after that point, there hasn't been much changes. But I have been tweaking it here and there, just sort of adding a little document here that sort of helps the council, or tweaking the wording on this rule here because there was a bit of ambiguity. I still do that from time to time. Like if you've bought the Den of Wolves pack in November 2022, it'll be slightly different from if you bought the Den of Wolves pack in like February 2022. Like every now and then, I'll just like tweak a rule and then resave everything. But they're like I say, they're really small things like quality of life things, or just about sort of ambiguities, or little things that I thought could do a little bit better.
And so, I guess reflecting on that, looking back at the first design, or even the iterations that you've reached now, what are you most proud of for the design of Den of Wolves? What's the thing that you most are satisfied with, and how it's played out in action over all these years?
Um, I think just the elegancy of the core design of the mechanics. Like I said, you've got these resources, and the players produce them, and the players can consume them. And this is why the game requires so few controls to run, is because the players run their own game for the most part. Um, most of the time, they're picking up their own resources, they're giving them out, they're talking to each other. It's a very sort of player-led rule set, which also just seems to work surprisingly well. So I think I'm just really happy with sort of how that just sort of the core mechanical elements of it, they feel quite elegant and very sort of efficient. And I think I'm quite happy with sort of how it runs. It's kind of the most boring answer, right? Just like the basics of the game, but it is the thing I think is the thing that makes me happiest when I sort of look at the design as a whole and how well it's done.
Yeah, no, I can't blame you.
And is there anything about the design that it sounds like maybe no, but is there anything about the design that still niggles at you, or that you that you maybe think could have been done differently, or
I mean, there's always going to be like tiny things here or there, right? Like that's why I said I'm constantly sort of adding these little tweaks. Um,
Mm.
and I think the main thing would be I wish I'd made some of the documents and rules about the council clearer earlier, because I think there's a lot of talk about how councils in mega games are always too separated from the main game, and they're sort of ineffective and they don't need to be there. Um, and I really think that sort of these council games are really important. I mean, obviously it depends on the game, but I've always tried to make the Den of Wolves Council as important and connected to the main game as possible. And I think with a lot of the stuff that's in the pack now, I believe that it is, especially if the control team are doing a really good job of making sure that's happening. And I wish that had been in there sort of earlier. When I started, it was much more just sort of the council just sort of goes and does their thing, and there's not a huge amount of game mechanics and game documentation to support them, which there is now. But yeah, I think one of the things that still bothers me, to be honest, is actually just some of the counters. So especially there's the wolves have a lot of basic sort of fighter ships and boarding ships, but they also have these big ships like cruisers and stuff that can come in if you're really not jumping enough. And the design of those was super minimalist. It's basically just a white box that says enemy cruiser on it and has some health boxes. And I just don't have the time or the energy to go back and redesign those now. And I wish I'd put in a bit more effort in. I do defend the minimalist design of Den of Wolves. Maybe it could look a bit nicer, but I've always been a strong belief that like if a game's good, then you want to prioritize things like readability and accessibility over and printability as well. Like I love all these beautiful designs people have come up with for Den of Wolves and just mega games in general. But like if I have to print off 36-page A5 color rulebook, my printer's going to die pretty quick. So I think a lot of amateur designers out there appreciate just how much white there is in Den of Wolves.
Yeah,
It's a very easy to print game, relatively speaking. But yeah, I think I could maybe have made it look a bit nicer and a bit more colorful in certain parts, especially those big wolf ships.
yeah. I think that's a good point on the accessibility thing too, because I know with the games that we do in Sydney, and a lot of the games in Australia, we do like to make them pretty shiny, even if they're still quite minimalist with the components. There's quite a bit of design work that goes into them, and it does make it a bit harder to produce them, a bit more expensive, a bit more time consuming. So
Yeah.
totally makes sense, especially when this game as a whole is quite an accessible game, and it's like you've said, it's got a lot of reasons why it would be a good first mega game for people to run.
Yeah, and just sort of not having as much visual noise makes it easier to sort of play the game and read things, especially if you struggle with that kind of thing. I often do. But yeah, I think there's advantages to sort of a very minimalist design that doesn't look amazing.
Yeah. And so Den of Wolves is still available. People can
Mhm.
grab it. We will have a link to that when we publish. For people who do pick it up or who've always wanted to run it but weren't sure it's for them, what would be your number one sort of bit of advice specifically for running Den of Wolves?
Well, cast your wolves carefully is important. I think most people do that okay, though. I mean, like I said, if you don't know anything about your players, maybe just be upfront with the fact that there are wolves and ask people if they want to be a wolf when they sign up.
Mm,
If you're more familiar with your players, then you might not need to do that. But like I said, it's not a big deal. I think your control team, make sure your control team really know how like wolf attacks work and how FTL jumps work, because a lot of what Den of Wolves is pretty, like I said, it's pretty basic player driven. But when those wolf attacks happen and when the FTL jumps happen, you want control to be able to resolve them really quickly, and they're quite complicated for control. So you want to just make sure everyone's ready to go and get that stuff done, so the players aren't waiting too long for that kind of resolution. And also, as I said before, making sure that the council feels like they're connected to the rest of the game is really important. Make sure, if you can, try and help keep them productive without taking agency too far from the players. And when they do make a law, make sure the whole room is aware that that's happened, and make sure that if any players are choosing to break it or ignore it, that is being communicated and players are dealing with it if they choose to do so. So I think just sort of that whole element of sort of facilitation, I think, is important
yeah.
and easy to miss.
And it sounds like the
Awesome.
game's well documented for helping people do all that. So that's awesome.
Hopefully so, yeah.
Well, I think that brings this to a close. Thank you so much for joining us, John. It was absolutely awesome to pick your brain on this design.
It's been lovely talking to you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, thank you. Where can people find you if they want to get Den of Wolves for themselves, or if they want to check out your other designs and other stuff you're working on?
You can find me at my website and email, swmegagames.co.uk, and you can always contact me at contact@swmegagames.co.uk. Generally pretty easy to get to by email.
Great. Well, thanks again, John.
Awesome.
Really appreciate it. I'm glad we could finally talk about Den of Wolves.
Yeah, it's only taken you 6 years.